it's great to be here, and thanks so much for inviting me back, Sarah. And I see some familiar faces in the audience, so it's great to be here. Today I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing looking at climate change adaptation at the global level and the funds that are available to support developing countries as they go through the process of adapting to climate change. And I just want to start off by acknowledging that this research project is part of a broader collaboration that Coco mentioned that we established when I was here at Fletcher with the United Nations Development Program and the Climate Policy Lab at Fletcher. And so one of the advantages of this is that this research is very much driven by real questions that UNDP has, and it's designed to really meet some of the needs of developing countries. So I just want to start off, see if I can get this to, no. Where's the trick here?
Now it should.
Okay. So I just want to start off with a big picture of what do we mean by climate change adaptation. I'm sure all of you are familiar with climate change and of the many, many impacts that this is having around the world. And so if we step back to kind of how can we respond to this crisis, there's three giant categories of ways we can react. We can obviously mitigate climate impacts by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's lots of different policies designed to do that. And the more that we can do of that, the better it will be, because that will keep global temperatures from rising as much as they would if we put in less effort. Then we can adapt, and that will include adjusting systems and behaviors to better manage these climate impacts. And then if we don't do enough mitigation and adaptation, it's always important to remember that there is a third option, and that's suffering. And I just like to start off with that framing because there's historically been kind of this push to say, let's focus on mitigation first, and then eventually we'll get to adaptation. But we don't want to delay on mitigation, so let's focus there first. And that's really kind of an outdated way of thinking about the problem. Adaptation has to happen now so that we can avoid as much suffering as possible. So I have up here just the IPCC definition for adaptation, and I just wanted to highlight a couple points about this. That this includes both adjustments in natural systems and human systems, and adaptation will kind of necessitate changes in both, and then obviously the two are very closely connected. And then it can be to either existing climate events or anticipated climate events. So we can be adapting to changes that are already being experienced on the ground, and we can be looking ahead to projections of what we might expect we need to adapt to in the future. And then finally, the definition does kind of leave open the possibility that climate change could actually create new opportunities. And while we know that most of the impacts of climate change are going to have negative consequences and create challenges, it is important to recognize that there might be some opportunities, and always to be kind of mindful of that when designing policies. So the urgency of kind of climate change has really been put front and center in the latest IPCC report that came out last fall that was looking at what does a 1.5 degree of warming world look like compared to 2 degrees of warming. And one of the biggest takeaways from that report, and that's kind of what's made the headlines, is that we need to be acting really quickly right now to reduce emissions so that we can try and keep warming to limit it as much as possible. But the report also really clearly outlines what all of those negative impacts of climate change will look like. And so here, I'm not going to go into detail on this graph, but what this shows is for a whole bunch of different ecosystems around the world, how much of a risk is associated with warming. And so you can see that gray bar is the amount of warming that's kind of current warming, the warming that we've experienced in the time frame of 2006 to 2015. And so already you can see some of those risks are already quite high. We know that there's environmental issues in many of these ecosystems driven by rising temperatures already. But you can see that as we look to see temperatures increase, those risks rise really, really dramatically. And so it just is to sort of drive home the point that adaptation is a really urgent problem. There's been a lot of different estimates, and these estimates vary wildly in the scale of how much it's going to cost for the world to adapt to this amount of warming. And there's a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of what this will cost. First of all, we don't know how much warming we should be anticipating. Are we headed for a 1.5 degree world, or are we headed for, as many of the projections suggest, more like a 4 degrees of warming world? Obviously, it's going to cost a lot more the higher our temperature increases. We also don't know how quickly we're going to be able to make these changes and how easily we're going to adjust our systems, our governmental systems, our behavioral systems, how quickly ecosystems will respond, and how costly all of that will be. And so some of these numbers are a bit dated, but the main message remains the same. The costs are very, very large. And the challenge is that it's one thing for a country like the United States to say it's going to be very expensive for the US to adapt to climate change, but we actually do have money in this country that can be used to do that. And it's more a question of political priorities and how we want to allocate money, and whether this is adapting to climate change is something that we choose to spend the money we have on. For many other countries, that's not the choice that's available. Their domestic budgets are very small in many developing countries, which is where these climate impacts are going to be felt the most. And so because climate change is a kind of global problem, there's been a very concerted effort to address this internationally. And the response has obviously not been sufficient yet to address the problem, but there's been a number of different ways that the international community has come together to support developing countries as they work to adapt to climate change. And one of those ways is through putting together dedicated funds that are available for developing countries to access funding to help them with their adaptation. And so here are listed on the top are the logos of the 3 major international funds for climate adaptation. The GEF, the Global Environment Facility, has sort of hosts the oldest adaptation funds. These are called the Least Developed Country Fund, and then the Special Climate Change Fund. And these funds were established under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to support the sort of initial demonstration and piloting of adaptation projects. The Adaptation Fund was another funding mechanism established under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this fund is very much focused on concrete projects. And then the newest fund, and as you can see from this graph, the biggest player in town is the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund was established in 2010 as an additional financial mechanism to support climate change. And the Green Climate Fund is a bit different in that it supports both mitigation and adaptation. And there's a commitment that it would be 50% to mitigation, 50% to adaptation. One of the things to point out here is that there's a huge difference between the blue bar is how much has been committed and pledged for the fund, and then this gray bar is how much has actually been dispersed to developing countries. So the Green Climate Fund is a lot newer. This is This data, again, is from 2017, and there's been a lot of efforts to disperse funds since then, so these numbers look a little bit better now. But one of the big questions is, how do the decisions around who gets that money? This is obviously compared to this last graph of how much is needed. These numbers are much, much smaller. There's a lot. They're big. These are in millions and millions of dollars. They're on a global scale. It's still a significant amount of money, but compared to the need of all the developing countries, these are still quite small funds. And so important decisions have to be made about how to allocate that funding. And so this research project is really looking at that question of how do we make those decisions around limited resources, there's limited amount of funding available globally, and it's difficult decisions about who's going to get that funding and what it should be spent on. One of the challenges that for mitigation, we have a really clear metric of what success looks like. If we reduce emissions, then we've helped to mitigate climate change. For adaptation, it's much less clear what success looks like. What would it mean to have successfully adapted to climate change? What kind of options are going to be the most successful? And so it's much harder to make decisions about what's a good project and what's a bad project. And one of the biggest challenges is that the relationship between adapting to climate change and developing as a country are really close. So there's a lot of ways where the types of interventions that you might do, like an agriculture project where you're helping farmers to adopt new crops or new kind of techniques for better soil and water management, that's good for their development. That's going to help raise their incomes. It's going to put them on a better development pathway. But it also is going to help them adapt to climate change in a world where there's more droughts and where rainfall is less predictable. Having better farming practices will put them in a better condition. And so the question is, should that be funded with these very scarce climate resources, or should that be something that should be funded with the much larger pool of money for development finance? And so the real question is, how do we make those decisions? This has become a very political issue. And I'm just putting up here a couple of headlines that came out in the last year over the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund has made several high-profile decisions about whether projects should or should not get funded. And those decisions have really hinged on this question of, is this climate related? Is this addressing a climate problem, or is this addressing a broader development problem? So the headline doesn't sound very good for the Green Climate Fund. Rich countries oppose bid to drought-proof Ethiopian communities. Ethiopia had put together a proposal to address drought in rural communities through water management strategies, particularly focused with women farmers. And the Green Climate Fund rejected it, saying, this looks like development. This doesn't look like a climate change project. And then from this controversy and a couple other projects, there's a huge sort of international sort of memo that was put together from NGO leaders around the world urging the Green Climate Fund to take a sort of a broader perspective on what adaptation means, to not think very narrowly of like, it must be something that's very explicitly directed to adaptation, to sort of a climate impact, and think about how do we build resilience of these climate vulnerable communities more broadly. The literature on this question does recognize that there are tensions here. And so a lot of times, think of this in terms of a spectrum, recognizing that good development and adaptation are really closely linked, and that there's some types of interventions that are going to be very explicitly about confronting climate impacts. So if you were to build a seawall, that's going to be very directly about addressing sea level rise. It doesn't really have a lot of sort of development benefits other than addressing sea level rise. So that would fall on kind of one end of the spectrum. Addressing drivers of vulnerability, something like we know that poverty makes people much more vulnerable when there's extreme events or other climate impacts. So an intervention that's addressing poverty is addressing those underlying drivers of vulnerability, but it's not specifically responding to climate change. And so we can kind of map different types of adaptation interventions across this spectrum. And the question is, where along the spectrum do you draw the line? To make this a little more concrete, it's helpful to think about what are the whole kind of range and spectrum of types of interventions that we could think about for adaptation. And this is a typology. There's lots of different ways to think about this, but one of the ways that's really gotten a lot of traction is this typology that went through all of the global environment facility projects. So it's very much based on what's been done in practice. It's not a very driven by theory approach. It's driven by what's been done on the ground. And through that analysis, these authors came up with this typology. You can think of adoption of practices, technologies, and behaviors as one type of adaptation. You can think about infrastructure, building new infrastructure that's going to react better to climate change as another type. Capacity building, building the capacity of governments, of NGOs, and of others, and even individuals to respond to climate events is another form of adaptation. Ecosystem-based adaptation, there's a lot of really interesting work being done right now on particularly things like mangroves and how much more effective those kind of green infrastructure approaches can be compared to a hard infrastructure seawall type approach. And obviously, those ecosystem-based approaches can have a lot of additional benefits beyond just adapting to climate change. Financing strategies, things like insurance products that can help to cover risks for extreme events or for drought. Policy and planning. A lot of times we need to think about adaptation in terms of changing entire systems and the policies that go with that. And so it's not just about individual interventions, but about the whole policy landscape. And then also warning and observing systems, recognizing that climate information and data around climate change can help inform all of these decisions and help support many of these other different approaches. So when we're talking about what kind of interventions do we want to be supporting through these funds and what should be considered development, these are the kind of the range of options that are on the table. So in terms of the way the literature thinks about this, another way to think about this is in terms of are these interventions, what types of capacities, and this is more thinking about it at the individual level, are these interventions supporting? And so a lot of times you think about this as generic capacities. These are things that are going to help people to be able to manage a whole range of different circumstances and shocks and stresses in their lives. And then specific capacities that are going to be much more targeted to addressing climate change directly. And a lot of times what the literature says is that if you have low generic capacity and low specific capacity, if you don't have the ability to manage all of these other challenges or climate change, you're going to be stuck in a poverty trap of nothing good is going to happen. But there's also dangers if you invest too much only in one or the other. And that the real sweet spot of sustainable adaptation is when you're able to combine those capacities and help build the capacities of individuals across the whole range and spectrum. So this is really an argument that we need to be investing in both approaches if we want to do adaptation well. So going into specifically what we were looking at in this study, we know that this question of it needs to be some climate related. The project needs to show that it's a climate change problem and not just development in general. And this is the term that's used to describe this in kind of adaptation finance is additionality. So the costs of the project have to be additional to the costs of doing development. And the argument here is that if it's just the cost of doing development, let's use development money to do that. And let's use the climate money to fund the additional costs of climate change. And we know that those kind of decisions around what funding is available is going to influence what gets done on the ground. And so we're trying to understand what are the different arguments that have been successfully made for why should this receive climate funding. So we looked at a sample of the projects that have been done across these four funds. Although this part of the analysis, some of it's still ongoing. So this is from the GEF projects and the Adaptation Fund projects. And what we did was we created a sample that's representative in terms of the different regions of the world where these projects are happening. You can see that the majority of projects, about half of them overall, are taking place in Africa. The next most common region is East Asia and the Pacific, and then fairly evenly distributed across other developing countries. We also were interested in making sure that our sample was representative over time, particularly because kind of the norms around adaptation have changed. Adaptation is a really rapidly evolving field, and so wanted to make sure we were capturing these differences across time. And then also the sectors. You can imagine that the way that these arguments get made might look very different for something like agriculture compared to a coastal project. And so we wanted to have good representation across all of those sectors. So what we did was we looked at the text in the project proposals to see what kind of arguments they were making for why they should receive this funding. And from that textual analysis, we developed a typology of different arguments that have been successfully made. The reason that this is going to be helpful for countries is that these funds have all said you need to be able to prove that this is climate related and not just development, but they haven't given countries a lot of guidance on how would you actually successfully do that? What kind of arguments would you make in order to prove that you should get this funding? And so through this project, we can say, well, here are the types of arguments that other projects have made that have been successful. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but I just wanted to put this diagram up here to show you that there's a huge amount of complexity in the types of arguments that projects are making. And there's a lot of nuance in the way that they're claiming that they should be able to get funding. But if we ignore some of the details and go for the big picture, there's three major arguments that we've seen that projects are making in the way that why they should get funding. The first is a mainstreaming argument. And this is saying that the goal of this project is to integrate climate change into everything that the country is doing. And so we need these funds to help insert climate change into all of the policies and plans that are ongoing in the country. And so it's not that the policies and plans are necessarily climate related, but arguing they should all consider climate change. And we need help to be able to adjust all of them to address climate change. The second argument is what we're calling a climate proofing argument. And this is basically saying that there's often a baseline, there's a development project that's going on in the country, and it's doing really good work, but it's not taking into account climate change. And so that project needs to be modified so that the investments that are made aren't at risk from climate change. So this is more about saying what's being done right now is at risk if we don't invest more. It's a little bit different than the mainstreaming argument, which is saying we need to integrate it into our policies and plans. And then the third, which is a bit less common, but is a little more concrete, is saying that this is demonstrating the value of these adaptation technologies or approaches. And so we need to invest in this very concrete project so that everyone can see what's happening, see that this works, and then it can be adopted more widely through the country. So I just have up here a couple of quotes from projects that made these types of arguments. So for demonstration, this project that's actually a global project that's in multiple different countries. Said pilot demonstration activities will deliver adaptation benefits. These benefits will be integral for future replication and upscaling, and also to identify larger scale investment opportunities. So the argument there is that it's not about what's going to be done with the specific funding itself, and that individual project is going to have such a huge impact, but that doing that small project will catalyze additional funding, and that's why it's worth making the investment. You can see this project from Morocco that's looking to climate-proof. It's looking at helping the port of Morocco, which is really, really important part of their economy, to be more resilient to climate change. So this focuses on building additional climate-resilient features in Moroccan port infrastructure through rehabilitation and building projects. The intent is to finance upgrades and building of additional port infrastructure that is climate-resilient. So the argument here is there's already a huge investment in the port that's being made, and we just need a little extra money to make it more climate-proof. And then this, I'm not going to read the mainstream one because it's a bit long, but you can see it, this argument from Afghanistan, that information on climate change, climate projections, the data isn't available in the country, and so this project will help get that data available to the different government ministries that need that to be able to make better decision making. So here's just kind of a summary of where across the projects these different arguments came out, and you can see that there's actually a pretty wide distribution across the three arguments. They're all fairly evenly common. I mean, climate proofing pops up a little bit more frequently, but all three of these arguments are made across a lot of different projects. One of the things that's interesting is that the JEF very explicitly in its guidance has always said we're going to only fund those additional costs of climate change. The adaptation fund is set up a bit differently. It's always promised that it's going to cover the full costs of adaptation. So it's kind of set itself in opposition of saying, we don't fund only the additional costs, we fund the whole cost of the project. But what we found was that projects were making pretty much the exact same arguments, regardless of whether they were applying to the Global Environment Facility or to the Adaptation Fund, which suggests that there's kind of norms that have developed around how you make a good argument for adaptation. And then many of the arguments, many of the projects relied on multiple arguments. They weren't kind of saying, we're just doing climate proofing or we're just doing demonstration. They were really kind of making multiple cases for why they should get this funding. And then a lot of the projects, and I would argue this is a bit more of kind of a critical commentary, because of this requirement that they are reacting specifically to climate change, a lot of the proposals are more focused on the types of adaptation interventions that are going to respond very specifically to climate change, and perhaps leaving out some of those broader resilience building approaches. So we see a lot more emphasis on something like climate information systems, which is really easy to argue that this is climate related. It's in the title of the intervention. It's about climate data. Of course it's climate related. Whereas something that's more closely related to addressing poverty or sort of some of the more baseline development issues that are arguably just as important for helping people adapt to climate change are harder to make this argument. And so you're seeing them pop up less in these funds. And so, I mean, that's the real implication here, is that this seemingly kind of technical question of how do you describe why you're eligible for funding is actually shaping which types of adaptation interventions are able to receive funding, and might be leaving out a whole category of approaches and sort of tools in our toolbox that we're not funding because they don't fit as nice and neatly into these templates and boxes. So this is still an ongoing research project. So we've done this initial analysis. We're now working on looking at the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund proposals are much, much longer and more complex, so it's taking us a little bit longer to get through them. They're also extremely, as those initial sort of the news articles that I showed you, it's extremely political, so we wanted to make sure we really were confident in our typology and our methodology before we started analyzing the Green Climate Fund. We're also interested in trying to get behind the black box. What we've looked at right now are the final proposals that were successful. One of the things that has happened in all of these is that there's been a lot of back and forth of drafts. So what we're seeing is the final product. What we don't always know is what critiques did those projects get that they had to address in order to get to meet these criteria for funding. So we're looking at doing some case studies and diving into all of the revisions. And this is where our partnership with UNDP is really helpful, that they can help us access some of those early drafts and share the feedback that they've received from the funders on their proposals. And then sort of here you can see the Green Climate Fund, and we'll be looking at the adaptation projects, but then also this really interesting category, what they call the cross-cutting projects. And this goes back to the fact that I said the Green Climate Fund funds both mitigation and adaptation. And they have this category of projects that fund both. And so some of these we'll be looking at as well, and those might make somewhat different arguments because they're looking not just at adaptation. So I will leave it there, and we should have plenty of time for questions. I've covered a lot of material, and so I really look forward to, hopefully I've just kind of teased you with some of the issues going on in adaptation finance right now.
Laura, is there a question there?
Yeah, this is more of like a specific question, but I was just wondering, like, what sorts of institutions do you get, does the Green Climate Fund get proposals from?
So, okay, I'll go back because I have logos of a bunch of the big ones up here. So some of these are UN agencies. A lot are UN agencies. The United Nations Development Program, which is our partner for this, overall in this portfolio has received about half of the projects. So they're by far the biggest. The World Bank is also a big player, the Regional Development Bank, so the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, also do proposals. The way this kind of works is it's the country, the developing country, that is submitting the proposal. But the money often goes through these multilateral agencies that will sort of act as trustees of the money and help manage the project on behalf of the governments. Increasingly, there's been a lot of critique that the whole point is to be supporting developing countries. Why are we giving the money to these UN agencies and development banks instead of directly giving it to developing countries? And so the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund have set up a new funding model called direct access, where either government ministries or local NGOs can apply to be an organization that's eligible to apply for funding. It's a really long, difficult process to get approval. It basically requires demonstrating that you can manage large amounts of money, but there's a push to move in that direction.
Can you talk about how the Green Climate Fund is funded by countries?
Sure. This is a hot topic right now. So the Green Climate Fund was set up as kind of in 2010 in the UN negotiations. There's a commitment on the part of developed countries to identify $100 billion per year annually by 2020. And so the Green Climate Fund was set up to manage that pledge. Now, the amount of money that has actually flowed into the Green Climate Fund is a small fraction of that pledge that was made. That pledge was reiterated in Paris, and it continues to be reiterated, but so far the gap is huge. Right now, the Green Climate Fund has just about finished dispersing all of its initial contributions, and it's beginning the process of replenishment, which basically means that developed countries are sort of promising money and putting it into the pool that is then available to the Green Climate Fund to disperse to developing countries.
Is it based on a percentage of their GPD or?
No, it's based on voluntary contributions from developed countries. I mean, there's, in general, kind of in terms of development aid, internationally there's been kind of a commitment or a best practice established that 0.7% of GDP should go towards development finance. I don't remember the exact numbers right now, but I'm not sure. I think maybe one country has actually lived up to that promise, and that's for all development aid. That's not for climate money in particular. So it's completely based on voluntary contributions. One of the things that's unique about the Green Climate Fund, and the reason why the Green Climate Fund numbers are so much bigger than almost anything else, is that the Green Climate Fund is experimenting with different types of finance, not just grant money coming from pledges from developed countries, but also more loans and financial instruments, looking at sovereign wealth funds, pension funds as a source of finance, and so really trying to get past that limitation.
Thank you for a really interesting talk, Laura. That was fun. I was curious, I apologize if I missed something, and perhaps the data just isn't there, but I was wondering if there's a way to look at the unsuccessful proposals to sort of systematically show that it's a flaw in argumentation.
Great question. The data is not there because there are not unsuccessful proposals. The way this works is that it's a politically driven process. And so, I mean, other than those two that made the headlines in the Green Climate Fund, a project in Ethiopia and another one in Bangladesh, there have never been any projects that anyone can think of that have been unsuccessful. What happens is that they'll be returned to the proposer for revisions. And it's just revision after revision. So it might take them 10 years before they submit something that can be approved by the board. But it's never rejected. So there's no clear data set of what wasn't accepted. There's just these drafts that are kind of constantly in revision.
Is there any idea of like, I take it you do have access though to like how long it takes or how many revisions for them to get funded?
No, we do not. Because we know once it was officially formally submitted, then we know the time frame. But there's a lot of behind the scenes, here, can you read this rough draft and let me know if this looks like I should submit it yet? And then the board would say, no, this isn't going to fly. Don't embarrass yourself by putting it up. Go back, keep working on it. We'll let you know when it will be approved. So it's all behind the scenes.
Fascinating. Seems like a hard thing to look into. One last question. Is there a way to look, so you looked at how it differs sort of spatially and temporally. Is there a way to look at if it differs by sort of the amount of money requested, like, or other factors that you think might be important players other than just the argumentation?
Yeah, we definitely could. We didn't set that as a way of setting our sample to be representative of that. The way this is going to play out in reality, though, is that the Green Climate Fund projects are much bigger than all of the others. So it's going to be basically saying, is the Green Climate Fund different than the others?
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about what some of the benefits and maybe even downsides are of having all of these different funds that are all essentially funding the same thing in maybe different ways?
It's a great question. So there's a lot of different kind of historical reasons that these funds were set up. And there's slight differences. A lot of the differences are in the governance of the funds. And different countries have preferences for different funds. So most developed countries, the donors, have a strong preference for the Green Climate Fund. And that's definitely the direction that most of the funding is moving. The adaptation funds, though, developing countries are very reluctant to let that die. There's a big question of, do we even need it now that we have the Green Climate Fund? But the governance of that is much more equal between developed and developing countries. And so they have a lot more of a role in making the decisions about what gets funded and what doesn't. So there is sort of a political reason to keep that still open. The challenge is if donors don't like it, then they don't put money into it, and so then it's not very effective. The JEF, I would say, kind of one of the differences also, not just in terms of governance, is that these smaller JEF projects are better suited to do more experimentation and to try out more novel approaches, whereas the Green Climate Fund's operating at a much bigger scale, and so the types of risks that those projects can take is a little bit more muted than some of these smaller funds. So I would argue that even though it seems like inefficient and kind of confusing, and it is, if there is coordination, there's potential for all of them to play really important different roles in the finance landscape. And the overall takeaway is there's not enough finance, so there's certainly not too much out there.
Thank you.
Laura, one of the things that I didn't catch from your presentation, and it may be because it's not there, is to what extent is magnitude of risk considered in decisions on whether or not to fund projects?
That's a great question. It's a complicated question. It definitely plays in, but these funds are all designed to fund developing country projects that inherently, in a lot of these places, the risk of doing anything is very high. So, I mean, for example, Mika and I have been working on a Green Climate Fund project with UNDP in Haiti. And we have experienced firsthand just the high political risks of trying to do anything in Haiti. Our final workshop has been postponed because of the political upheaval right now. And so these funds, one of the advantages of them is that they do have a much higher risk tolerance than something like private finance would ever be willing to accept. But at the same time, a big part of the proposals is demonstrating how the project is designed in ways that helps to mitigate some of those risks.
Thanks. So there, I should have asked for two parts on the risk thing.
Risk
so
is
there's
a big topic.
No, it's just, so you're exactly right. One is the financial risk, but what about the magnitude of the risk that the proposed adaptation project is intended to address?
Sure. The
to what extent
the
is
climate
that
risk.
part? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean that's a huge piece, and the way the language that often gets used about this is very much related to this. It's the climate rationale of saying what are the vulnerabilities, and then how is this intervention going to address those vulnerabilities? And so there's a big push to for proposals to make it clear that this project is targeting some of the most important risks in the country, climate risk. The other major criteria in terms of kind of is this project targeting the right thing is it targeting the country's priorities for adaptation? And so the process by which a country identifies its own priorities is very much going to be driven by what are its biggest vulnerabilities and risks. But that's obviously not the only thing that goes into that prioritization. Mika?
You mentioned the GCF on the board, they're not agreeing necessarily on what to fund in terms of whether it's part of development or not part of development. Is that being resolved by the board? Are they trying to come up with a common voice of, I mean, how do they make decisions if they don't agree on what should be
They are
funded?
working right now, and I believe there's draft decisions that are, I've seen draft decisions, but they're not yet final decisions for guidance on how to argue for the climate rationale, which gets to Anne's argument, and that is supposed to be driving the sort of climate arguments for the proposal. The GCF claims that they do not consider additionality as a funding criteria. The arguments that we're seeing suggest that that actually is driving the decision making. They claim that's not one of their official criteria. What happened in the case of the Ethiopian project was, so it was UNDP's project that was rejected. The proposal was resubmitted by a local NGO for a much smaller amount of money and was successfully approved. But the content remained basically the same. So in terms of how it played out, it really was much more political than that there was a strong kind of statement on how they were going to actually handle this moving forward.
So I'm doing a project for one of my classes on like climate change migration and that kind of stuff, and I was just wondering how like climate change migration refugees like fit in to like the framework of like adaptation. It's not mitigation obviously, but like adaptation versus the suffering category.
It's a good question.
And like whether that's has been like addressed at all in any of the like projects that have been submitted or like any of the climate funds?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think through specific projects. Climate migration is a really interesting topic right now. I would say it's on kind of the cutting edge of adaptation, and there's a whole lot of kind of really, I would say, not great literature on climate migration and climate refugees coming out from the 90s that was very sort of drawing causal arguments that actually weren't very well supported by data. And so that kind of gave that field a not great reputation. But now I've seen the issue of climate migration has kind of reemerged much more recently. And there's very clear evidence that this is, if not already, a driver of migration. It's very definitely going to be. And we've seen this in the news a lot with the migration from, so the migrant caravan from Central America being driven very much by droughts in Central America. And so, I think where you would place it between adaptation and suffering is somewhat a question of people's agency in it. So if people are migrating because they see a better option somewhere else and they are making a choice that they think that this will be a better life for them, then that clearly falls under an adaptation strategy. If it's kind of a last-ditch emergency measure and they're fleeing from crisis, it's much less clear whether that's adaptation or just a coping strategy is the other way to think about it. In terms of whether projects have specifically tackled this, I would say the main thing I've seen is the argument for trying to improve conditions locally to prevent migration. So a recognition that having people being forced to migrate is not an ideal outcome, and if we can engage in adaptation activities that can prevent that, that's usually preferable. So I think a lot of projects are kind of taking that angle. I've seen fewer projects that are actually tackling the what happens when people migrate. side of the question.
I love that for a topic for our lunch and learn. So if anybody has a suggestion for a local speaker that could talk about climate migration, please let me know after the talk.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm still trying to piece together my question, but I'm just thinking in terms of like your driver for wanting to do the research. Did things like equity, fairness, winners and losers kind of come into play? I mean, did you see, is part of your research like looking at projects that, or countries that should be funded but aren't being funded, or?
Well, I mean, I would say really broadly speaking, kind of my overall motivation for looking at adaptation in general is definitely very equity focused, and particularly my focus on developing countries is definitely driven by that. In terms of whether this project in particular gets at the equity pieces, I'm not sure it's as direct of a link. The way that I would say it comes out is I do feel like there's that this approach is driving a lot more technical approaches to adaptation rather than some approaches that would be much more human focused and focused on kind of reducing vulnerabilities for the most vulnerable people. And so in that way, I do worry that these climate funds are not necessarily addressing the most urgent adaptation needs of the most vulnerable, because some of those might not be very directly linked to climate change. And so yes, in that sense, I think equity is kind of an underlying theme driving this.
All right, any final questions? All right, let's thank her one more time.
Thanks for inviting me. No clock, so I have no idea where the time is.
No, it was short, but it was good because there were so many questions.
I figured it was